Hi, I'm TJ Brown, and welcome back to part 2 of an introduction to the archaeology of the Pacific Northwest and the Pacific Northwest as an archaeological study area. So, in part 1, I introduced me and our organization, the Northwest Archaeology History Project, and went over what is the Pacific Northwest, both as a region and as a study area, and provided some basic context around how to understand archaeological study areas or culture areas, as well as beginning to provide some basic context for how civilizations in the Pacific Northwest operated throughout in the recent past, such as kind of like 16 through 1800s, give or take. And then went over some of how villages looked and were structured in the Pacific Northwest, and kind of stopped at how regional variability in ecology and cultural setting affected some of the different kinds of villages, both in architecture and layout, that people had. So now, part 2, this is where we talk about kind of some more specifics around understanding how economies and politics operated within the civilizations of the Pacific Northwest. And so, the fun stuff, jobs and politics, everybody's favorite. It actually is my favorite. Those are the things I am most passionate about studying in history. But anyway, so first we're going to go over what do people's jobs kind of look like, how was labor organized, and then I'm going to talk about the all-important question, who's in charge? How did being in charge work? At least at kind of a basic generalized level. So as I said in part 1, life was kind of centered around a primary village and usually a secondary village or auxiliary encampment, something like that. And in the literature, you will often see these referred to as a winter village or a summer-fall village. And I don't particularly like using seasonal designations because I don't think they give a very accurate representation of when the villages were occupied or how they were used, etc. I mean, for example, in winter villages, for the most part, they were occupied year-long. So, and also in a lot of cases, people only had one village, so it's like the all-season village, but still call it the winter village. Anyway, it's not really that big of a deal. It's just a personal thing. So with that being said, the winter village is called the winter village because it is most intensively occupied during the winter, and it is strategically placed to mitigate the worst parts of having to live through the winter. So that means that they were often put in like river valleys or something like that, which mitigated the harshest winter conditions, or would be placed in areas that made access to fuel for keeping fires lit throughout the winter easier. Yes, easier. That's quite different from the auxiliary or secondary villages because their main purpose was maximize people's ability to harvest and acquire critical resources. So as resources became available, plants ripened or grew and fish began running and whatnot, people would leave the winter village in these kind of organized task groups or labor groups, and they would go to their secondary village to harvest whatever resources that village was positioned towards. There are hundreds, if not in the thousands, of different specific animals, plants, fish, and whatnot that people in the region here acquire for use of like medicine, raw materials for construction, tools, etc., and food, seasonings, ritual, ceremonial, religious purposes, what have you. But I'm really just going to focus on very few, maybe in the 5 to 8, we'll see what I get to end up mentioning, kind of staple resources. And the reason for that is the purpose of this is to give kind of a basic model of understanding how economies operated, not to get into the hyper specifics of how any one civilization or culture operated. So First, I'm going to talk about fishing. Well, the importance of fish could be quite variable from village to village or area to area. The regional importance, the criticality of fishing as a regional economic pursuit cannot be overstated. It was absolutely critical to keep things humming, and so much so that many had identified the Pacific Northwest as a culture area because of the shared dependence on fishing throughout the region. However, with that being said, I want to say again that in the past, archaeologists, historians, anthropologists have definitely overemphasized the importance of fishing, especially at a local level. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't profoundly important for keeping the regional economy humming. And this is why secondary villages were often located next to the major fisheries, because fishing was important. Anyway, so it wasn't just, although pretty much every edible fish you could imagine was harvested or acquired or eaten at some point, fishing was really focused upon the types of fish that could be mass harvested, primarily salmon, because they run in huge numbers throughout the Pacific Northwest. And you needed them to be mass harvestable because they often provided the primary source of protein throughout the winter. And so you needed an enormous amount of them. So like back in part 1, I talked about how these villages, you could be feeding upwards of 1,000 or more people over the course of many months. And so that's a lot of fish. In fact, there are estimates that during military conflicts that over 15 tons of fish were destroyed at one or two villages. And so it's an enormous amount of fish that was acquired. And so if you have to capture literal tons of fish meat over a relatively short period of time, how do you do this? Well, there's two key things. The first is you have to find a place where a lot of them go. So step 1 is to find where there's lots of fish. Where do they swim? And step 2 is to make them clump together so you can capture lots of them at once. In many places in the Pacific Northwest, there's two kind of ways that fish clump together. You can take advantage of natural topographic features, such as places like the famous fisheries at Celilo Falls near the Dalles, Oregon. There's also the Willamette Falls, which has been in the news a lot the past couple of years and now. And there's a lot more. These are just some kind of famous examples. And all of these provide natural areas where migrating fish swimming up these rivers get stuck and are forced to aggregate in large numbers. And so people for thousands and thousands of years have taken advantage of these natural corrals, basically, that make the fish get stuck. And then they get in these big clumps, and now you can just stand in one spot and harvest them. As soon as you have to move from place to place to get fish, you've lost all your efficiency. So for these natural areas like on Celilo, Kettle Falls, or up on the Fraser River, that used to run the Columbia River, those rivers are very large. And so once these fish start aggregating, you have to be able to reach them. You can't simply stand on the edge of the river and reach across with a net or something. It's pretty difficult to do that. So what people would do to facilitate being able to harvest these fish is you would build a series of scaffolding that would jut out from the sides of the riverbank or provide access to kind of closer to the middle of the river. So people would stand on these scaffolding structures that provided platforms across the river to net and spear fish that got trapped in these big groups at these natural areas. But these are just a few examples. So what about all the people that didn't have access to these natural fish corrals. Well, you made your own. And so these are called fish weirs or fish traps. Sometimes I think I've seen fish walls, but the idea is the same. You just create an artificial trap or obstacle in a river that forces fish to aggregate in a small area. Typically, you would use weirs on rivers smaller than the Columbia or Fraser. So these weirs took all different kinds of shapes and sizes and complexity, but the general purpose was you build a wall across a river, and through some sort of means, you corral fish into a smaller and smaller area. And so as they pass through this area, you either set a trap on the other side, and these traps would be made of woven materials and ropes and would be super tight. And so as the fish swam in, they couldn't get back out. And so more and more fish, because they had nowhere else to go and couldn't get around the structure, would be funneled into this trap. And when it was full, you would lift the trap up and put another one in, or dump out the fish and put it back. Or you would get just funneling the fish into smaller and smaller areas, and then they would just be netted up and tossed to the side or speared, just depending on what the circumstance was and the kind of the layout of the river that you're at. In some cases, especially in really shallow rivers or that had really extensive river bars, fish weirs would simply divert fish until they kind of swam up on the shore and would get themselves stuck. So you could just go and kind of scoop them all up. The point is that what you're trying to do is force huge amounts of fish into a smaller and smaller area so that you can capture as many as possible without, well, moving very little. And so these fish weirs, like I said, varied in kind of complexity and scale, but a lot of them, to create better access to these fish traps, would have alignments across the river, and then you build kind of a boardwalk across it. So these would either be almost a complete bridge from one side of the river to the other, or a partial one, but they provided you with a way to walk across the top of the weir so that you would have access to either netting or grabbing the traps or whatever from the weir as it filled up with tasty, tasty fish. And so, yeah, as I said, the complexity scale of these fish weirs varied quite a bit. Sometimes it'd be made of stone, sometimes wood. But regardless, many times they were pretty substantial structures that took a lot of time and effort to build and maintain. And as such, there was a lot of import placed upon these structures, and they would be owned by households, individuals, villages, and not anyone was allowed to use them. So they were protected and guarded to some extent. And depending on the size of the fish run or how it was, it might be that whole villages used a couple of weirs or used dozens, what have you. It just depends on how the river was set up. But I want to emphasize again, a lot of time and effort went into building these and maintaining these. And a lot of these, especially on the western part of the Pacific Northwest, are subject to enormous amounts of degradation every year, just because molding and rotting of wood is a constant problem in the very wet Pacific Northwest. But regardless, once you built your weir and you captured your tons of fish, simply acquiring these fish is just step one of a pretty complex process of finishing the job here. So I did not know how to finish that. But anyway, so after you get the fish, just step one, now you have lots of fish ready to become fish meat. And if you've ever bought fish and left it even in a refrigerator for just a couple days, you might be aware of just how fast fish goes bad. And so you might be asking, well, if you've captured tons of fish, how are they going to last for months? And that's a great question, because that is the whole point of capturing tons of salmon. You can't eat it now. It's for eating over an extended period of time. So people go, you capture the fish, you move it on, and think of it as almost like an assembly line system where another group of people, as fish were being acquired, would be preparing fish for further processing. And this usually involved cutting off the most oily bits, So like the head and non-edible bits, tails, filleting the fish and removing a lot of, spinal elements maybe. Just depends on, I don't know, the specifics of the fish and cultural tastes. But so they would prepare these fillets, and the whole idea of preparing the fillet and splitting open the fish was to maximize the surface area to volume exposed to the outside. And that's because you want to, once they were filleted and prepared like this, the whole point was to get them to have as little moisture as possible, so dehydrated. If you, depending on the area that you're in, which may be particularly windy and sun-bleached, drying fish could be done. It's possible to do it fairly passively just by, you would construct fish drying racks, and so the fillets of fish would be laid out and tied up on all these racks and widened to expose them to wind and sun so they would dry out quickly. However, if you have lots and lots of fish, that the wind drying part probably only works for smaller populations or for preparation for storage for things more like I just need it to last, the next couple weeks or something like that while I travel, not necessarily long-term storage for winter. Instead, if you have enormous amounts of fish you need to dry out and dehydrate, or you live in a very wet area with very little wind or direct sunlight to dry them out, smoking tended to be the best way to do this. And so along with building these weirs and keeping them maintained every year so they could be in use, people would also build smoke shacks or smoke houses where fish in the same way would be lined up, the fillets extended and exposed, and they would be smoked until they were completely dehydrated and kind of made into delicious salmon jerky. So once they're made into that salmon jerky, or just dehydrated, they would either be kept that way, or depending on the intended purpose of them, another way to prepare them for transportation and storage was this salmon jerky would be ground into kind of like a fish meal and turned into salmon cakes, fish cakes of some sort, which had the benefit of being very, very, very durable. So they kept really well and they stored really well. And you could pack an enormous amount of dried meat within very little area because of how dense these cakes were. And this was really important because if you remember what I said about winter villages being located somewhere very different from where you're catching these fish a lot of the time, you now have to figure out, okay, well, I had my group catch the fish. I have the other labor group prepping the fish for smoking, and then I have another group smoking fish and grinding the fish, what have you. Now I need to transport, again, literal tons of dried salmon back to the winter village. And so methods which maximized ease of transportation were pretty critical and often really important, even if they didn't extend the duration of preservation or anything like that. So how do you move tons of salmon in a timely manner? Boats. That's how. So that's was the primary method of transportation across the Pacific Northwest until, on the interior, the introduction of the horse at sometime after the 1500s. And so people would load up these canoes, which the Pacific Northwest is pretty famous for, but there's actually a wide variability of canoes. A lot of them, especially for these kind of, depending on the distance you had to travel or the complexity of the waterway, could be pretty expedient, or even made out of birch bark. So while not super durable, incredibly lightweight and good to navigate across a lot of the shallow streams and rivers, which is important because historically a lot of these rivers and streams fluctuated wildly before all these water control efforts kind of normalized the flow throughout the year. So you would move tons of this stuff onto a boat. The boat would go to your primary village, and then all the tasty food would be put in storage. But you're not done, because you can't just eat salmon. You can, but you'll actually die. It's called rabbit fever, rabbit sickness, I think. Anyway, fur traders talked about it got named after that because they just ate rabbit meat, and they ate meat all winter, and you go into like ketosis and die from liver or kidney failure. I don't know. I'm not a doctor, but it's bad. So you have to fill out your diet with things like sugars, carbohydrates, fats, um, general things that the body needs to live. And so you can't eat just salmon. So how do people fill out this other parts of the diet? And that brings us to plants. That also brings us to the end of part 2. Please like and subscribe and see our next episode where we cover the harvesting of plants and how these jobs worked. And after that, the last installment of the introductory series is the discussion of politics and who is in charge. So I hope you guys